So the aim for tonight is to present an introductory shiur to the introduction, basically, right? Because what you're going to be doing is learning the introduction, right? When you're going to the introduction to Perek Helek. What I'd like to do with you tonight is to kind of talk about why the Rambam wrote the introduction and what his goal is in the introduction, just to give you a klali, right, a general overview as to what it is that he's doing. And then, of course, your teachers will go into the details of what it is that Rambam is talking about. So there's one major reason that Rambam writes this introduction, and that is to tell you about Olam Haba. Because the Perek is Kol Yisrael, opens with Kol Yisrael Yeshlam Helek Olam Haba. All of Yisrael has Helek Olam Haba. You can't understand that unless you have a sense of what Olam Haba is. So if you just hear Olam Haba and think the world to come, and you're left with that, you're in trouble, because you don't get it. And so you cannot understand what the Perek is saying until you understand what Olam Haba is. Otherwise, it's meaningless to study the Perek. Right? So, Rambam, in the beginning of his commentary to Masechet Berachot, in the Perush HaMishnah, says something very important about how he's going to proceed in his commentary on the Mishnah. And he says, and I'm pretty much quoting, not paraphrasing, but there might be one or two words that are off in the translation. Rambam says, he takes some time to talk about emunah. And towards the end, he says, Yakar be'enai, it's more precious to me, or more precious in my eyes. L'lamed davar me'ikareh hadat, or me'esodeh hadat, to teach you things about the fundamental principles of our approach to Torah, right? How it is that we understand Torah. Mikol davar asher alamed, from anything else that I will teach you. Now, it's very significant for many reasons. First of all, because the Rambam teaches everything, right? There's practically no element of Torah that he does not touch, that he's not present, that he's not. So he says, in all of it, right? This is a man that spent years counting the mitzvot, elucidating the mitzvot, developing every aspect of the mitzvot, and he's saying to you, more important than anything else that I will teach you are the principles of our religious life, right? Essentially of our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's a principle that he's putting down. And the second thing is that it's important for him to teach principles, right? Which is why we call our journal Principles, right? That's why I wanted to call it that, because really what we're doing in the Habura is following that, right? Our point with Habura is to give you not nitty-gritty details, although that will come in as you learn. It's to give you frames, right? It's to give you sense of how we do, why we do, not just what we do, right? And you will be the judge as to whether we're doing that well or not, right? But, I think we're doing it pretty well so far. But that's the goal. So what Rambam is doing here is taking an opportunity to do what he said he was going to do, right? To teach you principles. And what he wants to do here is to teach you about Olam Haba. You must remember that while you're learning the introduction to Perek Helek, because it will be easy to get stuck into specific things that he's saying. But if you do not draw that back to what does this have to do with Olam Haba, you're missing. You're not learning the introduction appropriately, right? Now, in his development of that, as he speaks about that, he has several things that he touches on, right? Several things to deal with. Why? Because in order for you to know Olam Haba, I need you to know these things. And if you know these things, then I can start to talk to you about Olam Haba. If you don't know these things, then I can't even begin to talk to you about Olam Haba. Yeah? You with me? So there's sections here. I'm going to do an overview of the sections, right, without going into detail, just so that you can have a frame of what's happening. So the first thing that he does is he really, and the introduction deals with the first line, the first two lines really, of the opening Mishnah. The opening Mishnah says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek la'olam haba. All of Israel has a chelek, has a portion in Olam haba. Notice that it does not say Kol Yisrael harehem bnei Olam haba. Right? It doesn't say that all of Israel are members of Olam haba or hold. No, it says you've got a parking spot. Whether you access that or not is a different question, right? So everybody has a helek, right? As being a member of Israel, one of the perks of being a member of Israel is that you come with a designated spot in Olam haba, right? And it gives a pasuk to endorse this, right? It says, "Ve'amech kulam sadikim." Your nation are all righteous, right? Your nation are all righteous. Le'olam yurshu aretz. They will always inherit the land. And of course, that is already a figurative reading of the pasuk because it's talking about land. And the furthest thing from land is Olam haba. So yet the Hachamim are talking about Olam haba as aretz, right? So you'll have to deal with that later, but that's the pasuk that's given. More important here is that they're all tzaddikim, right? In other words, Israel are all considered by default tzaddikim, yeah? And that is, again, it's very easy to go off on tangents here, but on a tiny tangent, right? That is an important principle in general about Am Yisrael, right? That we consider Am Yisrael to be tzaddikim unless otherwise proven, right? The default is tzaddik, unless proven to be non-tzaddik, yeah? And that's why one of the most powerful things that Rambam writes in one of his letters, in the Iggeret HaShmad, is that how careful we have to be about saying bad things about Jews or to Jews, right? Because Moshe and Yeshaya and Eliyahu were terribly punished, and they were Malachei Elyon, says Rambam, right? They were great, because they said bad things about Am Yisrael, right? Eliyahu Navi was fired because of this, right? He was relieved of his duties as the official Navi because of this.
No questions as you go.
No questions as I go. I mean, if they're pressed, if you can't bear to you go. Okay. So only because I want to get the ideas out. So that's something that's presented over here, and therefore every member of Israel has a Helek Olam haba. You'll understand as you study through, not tonight necessarily, but you'll understand as you study through, if you keep putting things back to Olam haba as you study, why that's the case, right? Why is Sadiq necessary to access Olam haba, right? It's a very important issue, yeah? So it says that, and then the next words are, Ve'elu she'en lahem chelek Olam haba. And these are the ones who don't have a chelek in Olam haba, which is contradictory on the surface, right? Everybody's got a chelek, and these are the ones who don't have it. But you said everybody has a chelek, right? So what is this? These are the ones who don't have a chelek. So Harambam deals with those two lines in the introduction, right? He deals with the opening line in 90% of the introduction, and he deals with that second line in the close of the introduction once we've understood everything. You can't really understand why a person should lose a chelek on Olam or not have a chelek on Olam haba, again, until you not only understand Olam haba, but what does it mean to merit, right? To access a chelek on Olam haba. And then you can start to figure out what may be dodgy about, being able to get it. Now, it's also important to recognize that there are no guarantees for Olam haba, right? The minute that it says, Elu she'en lahem chelek le'olam haba, it's possible to lose it, right? So although everybody is born with it, if you are a member of Israel, it is very possible to lose it. And there are absolutely no guarantees that you will keep it in Judaism, right? There's none of this, except, someone is your savior and you're saved, right? There's no such promises in Judaism. You hope, you live a life of righteousness and you hope that you get Olam haba. And there's remarkable stories, right? The end of Makot brings this remarkable story, very, very, we talk about this story fairly often, right, as I do, right, in my shiurim, with Rabbi Hananiah Midradion, right, who's risking his life to teach Torah in a time of Shemad, and gets in trouble, and he goes to his Rav, Rabbi Yosef, in jail, and he says, Rabbi, mali ve'la olam haba. What do you say, my value of olam haba is? right? And you would think, if he would be a good good religious person, he would say, you Rabbi Hanina v'Torah, if not you, then who? But that's not what Rabbi Yosef said. He goes, I don't know. Klu ma'aseh b'al yadecha. And have you ever done a mitzvah in your life that's been genuine? And then they have to go through this whole dialogue and examine and maybe and and so on. All right, so it's not a guarantee, and that's one of the reasons why the Torah does not mention Olam Haba, because it doesn't really want you to pay attention to it. You only get in trouble if you pay attention to Olam Haba, because you will run the risk of doing things in order to be able to get into Olam Haba. And once you do that, you're already out. Right? It's a big problem. Okay, so what does Rambam do? The first thing that he does is say, well, since Olam Haba can be seen as a reward or as a response to achievement, here's the mistakes people make in terms of what we call gemul. Right? Here are the mistakes people make in terms of what they think they get if they do mitzvot properly. And he goes through various approaches, right? One of the things, forgive me, I'm going to mention just a bit of it, right? So one of the things that he says is, Da sheba'alei haTorah nechleku de'otehim. Right? He doesn't say hachamim. He says ba'alei haTorah. It's very different than hachamim. Right? Rambam differentiates between bona fide hachamim and people who tend to engage in Torah, but not necessarily seen by him as hachamim. Yeah, the Navi does this, right? The Navi refers to tofseh haTorah, the people who hold Torah, and it says tofseh haTorah lo yedauni. The Kadosh Baruch Hu says those who hold the Torah don't know me. Yeah, so it's possible to be, in charge of Torah, but have no relationship to Kadosh Baruch Hu. So nonetheless, these people have various things that they think about what reward looks like, right? Ultimate reward, right? Looks like, afterlife reward or kind of, end of the road reward looks like. And he discusses them and says they're all wrong. None of those are appropriate. And then he wants to begin to say, right, what Olam Haba is. But before he says what Olam Haba is, he talks about what it takes for somebody to be even oriented mentally, consciously, about Olam Haba. And what he does is a very strange thing. He gives a mashal. And he gives us a mashal about, look, let's say you want a child to study Torah. Yeah. What do you do with that child? To study Torah appropriately. Well, you have to give incentive to that child, because the child's not going to want to do that, right, on their own volition. They're not interested in that on their own volition. You have to give them something for it, right, that they do want. And he basically runs that example, or runs that mashal to insane levels. Because you think, like, a person gets to a certain adulthood and you don't need to do this anymore. Where does it end? He says it ends when the person has studied, right? And you want him to keep studying and say, look, keep studying. People will call you Hacham. They'll stand up for you. Your name will be known all over the place because of your great wisdom, right? Why is Rambam doing that? Rambam's doing that because what he wants to get to is a point in where no longer is reward necessary for a person. And where a person gets to a point in where they recognize the intrinsic value of being engaged in the endeavor for the sake of the endeavor. And that does not come to normal people, right? It comes to super people, right? It comes to people that really, really go through these stages that he outlines, right? You think it's crazy, the stages that he outlines. Not crazy. It's not crazy. It's required. And in the end he says, it's disgusting. Right? That this is what we need to do. On what level is it disgusting? It's disgusting if you look at it from the level of Olam Haba. But he goes, but it's absolutely necessary. Right? So I used to argue when I was an educator in school. By the time I became a head of school, I was in charge, so I did what I wanted. But until I was head of school, I used to argue with the people who were in charge of the school because I would give incentive to the children to pray. So I was in charge of prayers in the morning, and I was praying with a bunch of 8, 9, 10-year-olds, right? No 8, 9, or 10-year-old is sitting to pray appropriately. I mean, some of my best students were the worst prayers. So I would give them incentives. I would give them rewards. If they follow the words, if they said the words over and over again, And I was called on it, right, to the office, right, to speak to the principal, right, about that. That was not a good thing. They need to learn that this is intrinsic. And I said, look, the Rambam says, he goes, it says, v'chol ze meguneh. He goes, yeah, it says it's disgusting. I say, yeah, but to read the next words. The next words are, v'chol ze nitzrach. It's all necessary. Right? The fact that it's disgusting doesn't mean that it's not necessary. Right? It's just the way that human beings run. Right? We're a bunch of, gene machines motivated by evolutionary drives to get ahead. That's not going anywhere anytime soon. That's just the way that we're wired. Yeah. In any case, what would happen, with these kids? They would finally actually learn to pray. So at least they would know the words and they would get used to it, right? They wouldn't reject it, when they were sitting there. And then maybe eventually they might pray when they become like Abraham Avinu, and they But that's the point. Rambam says eventually if a person is going to ultimately achieve Olam Haba, they need to get to a point in where they understand the intrinsic value. And that means that they are no longer looking for what they can get out of it personally or selfishly. Right? There's a very big difference between recognizing intrinsic value and wanting to be part of that and seeing how can I get something from this. Right? A mashal to this is genuine love. Right? If a person genuinely loves someone, right, and that person loves back, well, you can say, well, they're so selfish. Right? Because, well, no, nobody says that. Everybody recognizes that there's just something beautiful about life that you are experiencing, that's it's intrinsic, right? It's for its own sake. But if you're loving to get something from the person and you're going through the motions of love in order to be able to get something from the person, well, then you're a prostitute, basically, right? Which is why the first chapter of Yeshaya accuses Am Yisrael of being prostitutes. It says them, how is it that the faithful city that was once faithful has become a prostitute? Which is just another way of saying, when did it happen that you started doing acts of love for payment? And says Rambam in Hilchot Teshubah that payment could be very high priced. It doesn't matter what the price of the payment is. A person can be a very, very high price prostitute. And a person can say, I'm doing this to get Olam Haba. And still, it will be selfish. Rather, oseh et haemet mipnei shu emet. You do what's true because it's true. There is nothing else. It's the only thing that's real. It's the only thing that matters. And that removes it from the selfish and brings you into reality, brings you into truth. And ultimately, and here's the kicker, connects you to God. Because if you're doing something that is true because it's true, you are now living in the space of truth. And guess who lives in the space of truth? V'Adonai Elohim emet. Right? God does. And if you don't have barriers between you and God, which is the selfish, right, what I can get from it, well, then you're living with God. And that is what Olam Haba is. Right? So Rambam needs to bring you there. Now, this is an abstract idea. Because what I've told you just now, you can say maybe you got it. Right? Maybe you got it. Right? But it really does take time to get. Because even if you think that you got what I just said, the chances are you didn't really get what I just said. Because once you have to put the pedal to the metal and actually test this and live this, you realize, well, wait a minute, I think I'm doing it, but I'm not really doing it, am I? And that's why at the very, very end of the entire thing, Rambam says, learn this over and over and over and over and over again. Right? He says, go over this, review it over and over and over. He goes, and if you think that you've got it, if you think you got it once or 10 times that you've reviewed it, Hashem yodea shebesheker hishalta. He goes, God knows you're a liar. Right? You absolutely have not gotten it. Right? Okay, so, and Rambam says to him, he goes, you don't understand what kind of work I've done over here, right? And he says, this is what I've done in order to be able to pull this together. So if Rambam is saying, I did all of this in order to be able to pull it together, you better, humble. We have to read this with humility and realize, I have no idea what I'm reading over here, even though I understand the words of what it is it's saying. Because it's abstract. And it is subtle. And it's sophisticated. And do you know how the Hachamim present abstract, subtle, sophisticated ideas? In parable. They don't say them outright, because nobody gets them outright. They present them in riddles. So then Rambam takes some time to talk about how the Hachamim present things, and how people understand how the Hachamim present things. And the reason he does this is not to teach that point. The reason he does this is to say, there are three categories he puts people in, right, in terms of how they understand the Hachamim. And he says, if you're in two of these three categories, stop reading, because you won't understand me. In other words, the whole point of even getting into that is only that we should understand what he's going to say, what he's going to eventually say. Right? I will say on this point, which I think is important, is Rambam matured after writing this. Right? Because Rambam says something very interesting later on in the introduction. He says, I'm going to write a book, he says, that explains all the midrashim of the Hachamim. And it will explain all of the key principles of Torah and so on and so forth. And he never wrote that book. And he explains in the beginning of the Moreh Nebuchim why he did not write that book. The reason he didn't write that book is because he said, I would have just ruined everything that the Hachamim did. The Hachamim spoke in parable in order to conceal things from people. And if I was just going to unravel all of the parables, I would be ruining everything the Hachamim wrote. Which is why, in my opinion, books that explain Midrashim are poor. They're first of all, usually very weak. They don't really explain Midrashim on the level that Midrashim should be understood. And B, they ruin what the Hachamim did, right? Rambam himself decided not to do that, right? Instead, he wrote Moreh Nebuchim. Yeah. Moreh Nebuchim is a whole other level, right? Moreh Nebuchim is, which is ingenious, right? What he actually did. He wrote a book that was able to deal with the ideas of the Midrashim without completely exposing the ideas of the Midrashim. So he presented it in another way that required a tremendous amount of prep and understanding to be able to get them, right? But it made it more accessible. But usually, people totally miss the understanding of Midrashim, because oftentimes Midrashim are very contextual, right? In other words, when the Hachamim, for example, right, they talk about Yaakov and Esav. Where do the Hachamim talk about Yaakov and Esav in Talmud? In Masechet Chulin. What does Masechet Chulin deal with? Gidan Hashem. Right? So it talks about the kashrut of Gidan Hashem. How are you supposed to, clean the gid, and what do you need to remove from the gid, and how does nikur happen, and so on. And all of a sudden you're in a discussion about Esav and Yaakov. Well, of course you're in a discussion about Yaakov and Esav, because the whole Gidan Hashem only has to do with the argument of Esav and Yaakov. Well, what does that have to do with anything? So if I'm not reading it within that movement, and I don't start to understand the underlying ideas of what should a damaged sciatic nerve by Esav to Yaakov mean, what is the meaning of it, right? It's not just that it happened. What does it mean that you cannot walk anymore? That your entire life from here on in is limping? What do legs mean? Well, you have to ask that question, right? So the minute that a person gives a cheap answer to that and says, well, it means that, don't deal with Rishaim, because, that's stupid. You could get that in any Musar book, right? I mean, for goodness sakes. That's why the Hachamim had to put it in a whole parable about it? No, you have to think about, well, what are legs for human beings? It's the first thing you have to think about. What does it mean that although Yaakov bested this, whatever this thing was that he was wrestling, he did not come out unscathed. He was damaged by this entity. And so on and so forth and so on. Right? But you realize, right, at least you can sense what's required in order to be able to actually deal with these things on a real, serious level. Right? We're not just talking about, okay. So Rambam, in order to be able to understand Olam Haba, you need to begin to understand the words of the Hachamim, which is an endeavor in and of itself, right? So he says, look, if you're in one of these two categories, nobody thinks they're in the two categories that he thinks nobody thinks they're in that category. But the reality is, if you're in one of these two, just stop reading. Why? Because you're going to hear things like, what is Olam Haba? It's a place in which the tzaddikim are sitting with crowns on their heads. If you think that a tzaddik is sitting in Olam Haba with kindergarten crown, on his head, like, you get in Kita Aleph or whatever it is for a Shabbat party, that's not Olam Haba. So you have to get what it is that they mean when they say that. And if you're not prepared to engage with the words of the Hachamim that way, then you're not going to ever get what it is that they mean when they say it. So that's why Rambam deals with that. Once he deals with that, then he says, okay, now, since I spoke about the mistakes people make, and the mistakes people make usually incorporate Gan Eden, Tchiyat HaMetim, and Yemot HaMashiach, let me explain briefly what those things are. And he explains briefly what those things are, a paragraph for each, right? And then he says, and now I'd like to explain to you about Olam Haba. And he actually writes, he goes, after all of that, he says, now I'll talk about what I actually want to talk about, right? And then he starts to talk about Olam Haba. And that's really important, right? How he starts to present Olam Haba. And he says, look, Olam Haba is the Tachlit. Olam Haba is the Tachlit. It's the goal. And if I recognize that the goal is to be able to ultimately have connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, existential sharing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's where it happens. What is that? What is there? You become Jordan Peterson, and he was like, well, what is that? What is there? What is happens? What is there? I have to deal with all of that. And then you have to deal with those things. Fine. But then, Rambam moves into dealing with the words of the Mishnah again. And he says, it says here that one of the people that do not have Olam Haba is the Epicurus. What is the Epicurus? We know, right, that Epicurus is Epicurus. Right? He doesn't believe in anything but this world, which is the antithesis of Olam Haba, right? He's antithetical to Olam Haba, Epicurus. And Epicureans were about the pleasure principle, right? We're here to enjoy and, engage in the joys of life. He was not of the Greeks that, believed in the golden mean or any of that nonsense, right? Just enjoy. So, Rambam does not bring that, right? I have no question that he knew that, right? But what he does is he brings the drasha of the Hachamim on the word in the Talmud. And the Hachamim are doresh the word Epicurus, right? And they say Epicurus is hefker, right? It's hefker means meaningless, right? It's people that treat things as meaningless. And ultimately, they are people that, and he writes here, humila aramit, right, is an Aramaic word, it is the making light of and scorning or belittling Torah or Chachmei Torah, either Torah itself or the Hachamim of the Torah, right? Therefore, they use that term as a general title for people who just don't believe in Torah, right? Who don't value Torah, right? They don't believe in Torah, whatever. That's it. So then he says, well, what does believing in Torah mean? How do you know when somebody is part of the endeavor or not? Now, here is where people have criticized Rambam, which gets under my skin, obviously. But they've criticized Rambam because what he does is he puts out 13 foundational principles. So this is what the whole edifice is built on, these 13 principles. And essentially what Rambam says, if any one of these 13 principles are not part of the belief system, right, the entire edifice collapses. One of them, if one of them is not sturdy and remember, he says it's a yesod, right? Again, it's translation from the Arabic. But Rav Kafir translated as yesod. Yesod means foundation. Foundation which you build upon. And therefore he says at the end, he says, not just if a person doesn't believe in these, he says if a person mitpakpek, if a person is not sure about these, well then he has shoddy foundation, right? It's a dodgy foundation. The building will not stand. And what is the building? Torah, right? Judaism, right? It will not stand. And he's very confident about this. Now, Rambam didn't get this from anywhere, right? In other words, it's not like he went to the Torah and the Torah said there are 13 principles. He did this. But he's absolutely right. There's absolutely no question as to whether he's right or not. And I've done many, many times shiurim in all different levels on these 13 principles and shown why it is, without question, that he's absolutely correct about every single one of these. And you remove one, the entire edifice falls apart. There's no question about it. And so it gets me upset, right? And this is my own personal gripe, right? I'm declaring, right? This is my own personal gripe, that people question these Yesodot. Simply say, well, where have we heard that there's 13 principles? Well, anyway, there's 13 principles, and there's a very good reason why. Because the foundation is never seen. You don't normally see the foundation. It's inherent. What is it?
So is it correct to describe them therefore as axiomatic?
Yes. It is correct to define them as axiomatic. Right? In the sense that for a typical Yisrael, they don't need to be proven. They are the working system within which a Yisrael sees the world. And nor can they really be proven, right? You can use logical assertion, which in the sense of an axiom is no longer an axiom, because you can't really logically prove axioms appropriately, because they're the givens to your logic, right? So in that sense, they're not axioms. Rambam could give logical reasons, not reasons to prove them, logical reasons as to why they are foundational, right? In other words, why you need these in order to be able to, yeah.
And the word in Arabic can use it for in Farsi as well. It's kind of like a root.
Mm-hmm. That's ikar. So sometimes they're called the ikarim. I don't like ikarim. I prefer Rav Kaffer's translation, because ikar means root. It means that this is, if you follow it down, this is where it comes from, right? I like foundation because it's, what are we building on? And if I don't have a firm foundation to build on, I can't build anything, right? So I can't have parts of Judaism without these, because it's a farce without these, yeah? So if I don't have prophecy, I don't get out of the gate, right? No Judaism, right, can function without the recognition of prophecy. Because if I don't have HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicating to me how it is that I'm supposed to serve Him, it's a fantasy of my own mind. And it is an insurmountable gap between me and HaKadosh Baruch Hu on an existential level. I need to hear from Him how it is that I'm supposed to. That's just an example, right? But all of them run that way. All of them run that way. So Rambam here didn't need to get them from anywhere, right? In the sense that, there's 13. He simply recognized in his brilliance, right? These are the foundational principles. If you pull away, you no longer have the system. That's what he asked himself for all intents and purposes. And he presented these are the things that you need in order to be able to answer. Other things you don't need in order to be able to have the system. They're important to the system. They may even be central to the system. But they are not fundamental to the system, right? They're not foundational to the system. These are foundational. And therefore he very confidently says, right, that if a person does not have these firmly, they really cannot be considered part of Klal Yisrael. Right? Now, I'll qualify that in a moment, but that's what he says here, and he's young, right? This is young Rambam, right? So again, he's matured since he's written this. It's very important to realize Rambam matures after writing this and changes things in the Mishneh Torah and in the Moreh Nevuchim later on, right? So he qualifies this too. Here he's very, very harsh, right? He says, if anybody even hesitates, right, or questions these foundations of any of these foundational principles, this person officially, by doing so, right, has left the klal of Israel. They are no longer to be related to, and this is very important. They are no longer to be related to as members of Klal Yisrael, right? They are to be kept out, not as members of Klal. And to what degree are they not to be members of Klal Yisrael? They're kafar be'ikar, right? They reject the ikar. Ikar is a root, right? The root. V'nikra min v'Epicurus. We call them a min and Epicurus. V'kotzez b'ntiot. They are cutting down saplings, which is a metaphor for uprooting the most bad. Yeah. And hoval ishnoto. It is an obligation to hate them, right? V'lish lashmido, and to destroy them. Well, that's pretty harsh, right? That's pretty harsh. And it's about such a person that it says, Lord, the ones that you hate, I hate. Right? So there's some fundamentalism creeping up over there, but of course, you're going to have fundamentalism at the foundations, right? That's where fundamentalism happens. Later, Rambam qualifies this in the Mishneh Torah, and he says, this, of course, is only if they understood these things, learned these things, completely got these things, and rejected these things of their own sound mind. This does not apply to somebody who was poorly educated, who was not educated, right, and had no idea about what it is that, Jewish stuff is, and then later came to it. And he goes so far as to say, even if they learned it later on, since it wasn't fundamental to their study as people, you can't treat them like this. You have to try and bring them in, right? And that's what we call a tinok shenishba, right? He says they're as if they were like children, babies that were taken captive by goyim, right? So what are you going to do? They don't recognize it, and that's where that whole idea of tinok shenishba comes from. In my opinion, every Jew on the planet today is a tinok shenishba. Right? Very rare to find somebody who fits this bill, right? But Rambam is writing here conceptually, right? More accurately, he's writing here conceptually. Why? Because he's saying, look, if a person is not holding of these things, then it doesn't matter what they practice. Like Rashi says beautifully, Rashi says on Techiyat HaMetim, right? So Rashi says, if a person accepts Techiyat HaMetim, but not because the Torah said so, right? Because biological engineering shows that we can do Techiyat HaMetim or whatever, so he believes in it. Right? He goes, Ma lanu v'lo dat shelo. Goes, what do we have anything to do with his crazy religion? What do you mean crazy religion? It's Techiyat HaMetim. So it's not our religion. Our religion is Techiyat HaMetim. It's from the Torah, and that's all. The fact that coincidentally he believes in the same thing that we believe, but from a completely different place, does not make him Jewish, right? Does not make him part of Judaism. Yeah. So there's some very serious points here. Very, very serious points. It doesn't matter that you keep Shabbat. Why do you keep Shabbat? That's a much more important question. Yeah? The why is the key, not the what. Yeah? So here Rambam is saying that Israel has a great deal to do with the way in which I see the world, the way in which I understand the mitzvot that I do, and so on. Yeah? And so he goes through these 13 principles, and he explains them, except for Techiyat HaMetim. He doesn't really explain Techiyat HaMetim very much, which people challenge him for later on, and then he has to protect him, to defend himself, and so on and so forth. I think it's a complete farce that people think that Rambam actually did not accept Techiyat HaMetim, to believe in Techiyat HaMetim himself. I reject that in toto. But nonetheless, that's what Rambam is doing over here. And in order to be able to present Olam Haba, he needs to do this. Right? So he says, look, if we're going to talk about a person who doesn't have Olam Haba, and I have to talk about Epicurus, I really do have to talk about what is the alternative to an Epicurus, right? What is not an Epicurus, right? And he basically says the person who does not accept these three things. However, very, very significantly, and I will point this out even though I'm sure it will be taught to you, he says on the flip side of that, if a person does hold of these things, they're a full-fledged member of Israel. V'chayav le'ovo. You have to love them. And you have to defend them. And you have to do everything that you can to protect them. Those are the criteria. It's not what they believe in terms of, or how they think in terms of their approach to learning Talmud, right? Or, whatever other kind of, a crazy ideological idea it might be. It doesn't matter if they think that tzniut is something other than you think it is. You have absolutely no right to speak ill about them, to consider them, foes in any way. You have nothing but to love them. And so he says very clearly over here, right? Once a person accepts these things and his faith to them, meaning his faithfulness to them, he lives by these things. He lives by these things, not just that he believes them. He lives by these things. This is how he conducts his life. That's Israel. That's what being a member of Israel is. You have an obligation to love that person. And to be kind and merciful to that person. And everything that God commanded upon us to do with each other in benevolence and good. Right? Those are the only criteria. Meaning, if these are intact, right? You have to treat every Jew this way. So, anyway. Questions? Chat.
About too much in the Shabbat.
Yeah.
It seems from the theory of when you just see what Chazal say about someone who doesn't believe things, that it's quite extreme. But then Rambam brings in the idea of too much in the
Yeah.
Shabbat, as you said, it's about the
Yes.
You use that whole idea.
Yes. Correct.
So doesn't that seem like we're veered away from how Chazal saw it?
No,
Or not?
because they were living in a different time. And the entire system was different. Think about it. Who was in charge of Jewish life at that time? Yeah. And it was very, very unified. Right? You didn't have Jews living all over the world in denominations of all kinds and colors and so on, and enlightenment. And, where do you end? Like, where do you stop? It was very, very simple in those days. So if you had somebody who was rebelling against that, either they were raised by wolves, right, or they learned everything and rebelled against it of their own volition, and that could not be tolerated. Like Jesus, he could not be tolerated. Right? He learned it all. He was a student of the Hachamim. He knew exactly what was going on, and at least in terms of the way that the story goes, he rejected it all. Well, we cannot keep him around. We cannot keep him as part of the family. If he does teshuvah, we of course accept him back into the family without a problem. Well, mostly, right? But in that behavior, in that teaching, right? What a person has in their own head, we cannot legislate for, really, right? How do I know that somebody doesn't hold from these things? Well, they start acting like they don't hold from these things. They start speaking like they don't hold from these things. That's how I know. What you have in your head, in the wee hours of the night, right? That you grapple with, that is not what Rambam is dealing with over here. He's talking about how do you know the person like that? Because you can see the way that they speak and act. They do not lead a life based on these things, right? They do not talk based on these things. Well, in that case, they're a problem to the family, and we've got to be careful about them. And why are they dangerous? Because they know exactly what they're doing. That's why. They're less dangerous when they have no idea what they're doing. And if you can bring them in, then that's better. Right?
I very much appreciated the point about once a person believes in these things, they are entering into Kalal Israel, and doesn't matter if you disagree about anything else, these are the 13...
You can argue,
right,
but you can't hate them, right? You can't treat them.
But with regards to Rambam's strict definition of Hagshama, with regards to anthropomorphizing God, would not quite a lot of learned people fall into the category of denying God's incorporeality by Rambam standards?
I don't think so. I think, again, it's a level of Tinok Shenishba. Right? It's a fact that Rambam hates it. He thinks it's stupid. It's terrible, right? And you have to do everything that you can to convince them otherwise. But the reality is that the reason why they believe that is because they were raised by Goyim. Genuinely. It's all around them. It was all around them. There was no way out of it, right? They literally were raised in the crucible of anthropomorphism. So that's why Rambam, by the way, when he does deal with it, he deals with it almost ad nauseum. Right? It's almost like when you're reading it, you're like, okay, I get it. All right, how much are you going to tell me that God's not physical, for goodness sakes? And Rambam spends so much time, this is only my personal opinion, right? Rambam spends so much time getting people to not think of God as physical. He spends almost no time in talking about how to constructively deal with the physical elements that are presented in the Torah. All he says is, negative attributes. I keep going on. But isn't really, it requires more. It requires an understanding of how am I supposed to actually relate to these things? What are examples? Give me as much time as you've spent on telling me how I have to be sholel all of this. Tell me how it is I'm supposed to incorporate all of this. And all he says is negative attributes, which is a very important thing. But I have to know how to apply that, right, to all of these elements. I was talking to a rabbi a great, great rabbi, right? A wonderful, wise man. He's part of our ilk in our Bet Midrash. And he's still tormented over the fact that God doesn't love him. which he should be, right? Because he just doesn't know how to. He doesn't get what does it mean that God, of course, God loves you, but He loves you in the sense that He does not love you. That's very, very hard for him. How am I can't. He can't bear it, right? So people struggle with this because we're A, human, and B, raised in everything anthropomorphic, right? So that's part of Tinok Shenishba. It's a Tinok Shenishba problem. Yes. I'll say one thing about it. I think just to close this off, sorry. If a person completely got it and understood it, and nonetheless said, I reject that in toto, right, and I am going to hold of God as a person, that's a different story. That's not what people were doing. That's not even what the Ravad was doing, right? Yeah.
Okay, maybe in connection with this, for illustration purposes. So if Jesus would come under the category of real Epicurus, would, for instance, chapter 3 be one, and what do we say about the first rabbis, third generation of Reform rabbis? They also fall under this category, or would they be considered maybe
I can't say about Shabtai Tzvi whether he was a bona fide Epicurus or not, right, in terms of the technical sense of the word. The problem with Shabtai Tzvi is that he was highly dangerous because the entire Jewish world was following him hook, line, and sinker from Poland to Aleppo. So he was public enemy number one, which thankfully my predecessor, Hacham Sasportas, fought very, very strongly. I believe very, very strongly that the merit of the Spanish and Portuguese community is in his merit. They've lasted this long only because of that man. Because he, against the entire tide of Jewish rabbinic thought, he stood against them all. Could have been that he was on the island at the time, but nonetheless, he stood against them all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was just
good to see you, Rav. Yes.
You noted, you said that the Rambam recognises there's a distinction to make in the kind of why we might do moral actions. So one is because we think we'll get rewarded for it. Right. And the second is because, I think you said, because it's right, it's true. But is there not a third, more refined way, which is that it is the particular characteristics of the circumstance before you? So, for example, suppose that there is someone outside in a tent, and someone's outside and you're in a tent, and it's raining, and it's etc., etc. The more reasons you can go through your head are, one is, oh my gosh, that person's suffering, and I'm going to go there, I'm going to go help them. Or second, it could be, what would be the right thing to do? What would the virtuous person do? And therefore I'm going to do it. And the third might be, morality, I'll be rewarded for it, and therefore I'm going to do it. Now, each of those seems to go on a different kind of levels of moral stain.
Yes.
The first one seems to be the purest. The second seems to be the second. But there's no reference to the first.
I think the
between the second and the first one, and the reason why I have a problem is in some sense, when does Judaism have an issue with the rightness of the action because it purely comes from the fact that it's right because Hashem says so? You can't. Does that prevent you from kind of looking at that? What seems to be the more morally pure.
Okay, well, that last bit that you're tacking on, right, is an additional point. But I think that the three levels that you presented, right, the first level is really what Rambam is saying when he says you do emit mipaneshu emit. In other words, you recognize that this is just real, right? It's what's real. It's what's before me as the real thing, right? Not to do this would be lying, right? Not to do this would be in a state of fiction, right? On that sense, right, where it is imminent before you, this is obviously a thing to do. The second thing you said is removed, right?
It's one thought you meant.
Sorry?
It's one thought.
You can explain it that way, yes, but essentially there is a gap between the connection of this person to the truth and their living of it, right? So they perceive it, but they're not in it, right? So they have still the distance that allows for them to choose otherwise. Right? The very fact that they could ask the question of the right thing to do would be, right? The alternative is still there, right? In the first example, it's almost as though the alternative is not even irrelevant, right? So that's very similar to how Rambam describes Adam in Gan Eden, right? And where, of course, he could have killed his wife, but it never crossed his mind, right? That would be something to do. What on earth, right? Would that be? What would that mean? So, in terms of the bit that you're talking about, is it because God decreed it or God made it so? It's a sophisticated question, first of all, and it requires a better answer than what I can present to you here. Glibly, ostensibly, right? What I would say to you is, there's a big question with regards to this, right? Are things right because God made them right, or are they right because they're right, or what makes something right? Yeah, what makes something appropriate or not? So one could say, on a certain level, right, that there are natural things that are right, and you would say, well, how are those things right? Well, it's because the way that God made the world, right? It's just the way that things are, which is not dissociating them from God, because to say this is the way that things are is saying, well, I mean, ourness, right, capital A, ourness, made it that things are. Yeah? There's something more to that, though, right? Because, in covenant, right, which is the way that we engage with Torah, covenant is not presenting universal truths. Right? Our Torah is not necessarily presenting to us universal truths. It's presenting to us terms for relationship. Within the terms of this relationship, this is what makes the relationship work. Yeah? Yeah? So that's really what Rambam is talking about over here. You do mitzvah mipnei shu emet. Right? You do truth because it's true, even within the context of it being true. Right? In other words, in the context of this relationship. And again, things can be true within the context of a relationship, right? A person has a wife that he loves. He's not going to spit in her face, right? Could he spit in her face? Yes. Could he choose not to spit in her face because it's the wrong thing to do? He could, right? But I mean, in the context of the relationship, the true thing is she's your wife, right? I don't know if that helped.
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. But I guess my further question is, would it make the action even morally better if kind of the inverse, where you do recognise that it's the cause of it?
It depends what you mean when you say that. I hate to go all Jordan Peterson on you, but it depends what you mean when you say that, right? If, when you say it's because of God, it's love, right? It's God. And that's all that matters, right? Well, then, yes, of course, that's what it is. It's about that, right? And that's why Rambam writes, you do it, he writes it also there in Hilchot Teshuvah. He says, you do the mitzvah mipnei ha'el shetzivah b'hem, right? But that's not because the good Lord, commanded it and therefore, no, it's because I love him. And we're in a relationship. And he said, and that's what matters. It's that simple. And that's why when Rav Yosef asked Rabbi Hanana B'Tradion, when he says, what about me in Olam Haba? When his question is, Klu ma'aseh ba'al yadecha, right? Did you ever have an opportunity to love God? To show genuine love for God, right? Not to get Olam Haba, not to just to... And he said, yeah, it was one time I just did a mitzvah because it was there, and He goes, okay, great. So, you've got it. He literally had to think. He remembered one time in his life where it was just purely out of, so that's the idea. Well, you had, yeah. So I'm giving everybody a chance. Yeah, so that's number 2 question. So we have to wait for that. Yeah, no.
Okay, so to my own discredit, I first sort of started getting into serious religious belief at sort of 15 with Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures. And
I'm sorry.
I know. And I thought sort of his presentation of sort of believing as if, acting as if God exists. Whatever, it's not him, it's a German philosopher in the 1800s, whatever. I've often thought about this in reference to like a line from the Yerushalmi.
I'll tell you why that's a problem. I just want to say, the reason why that's a problem is because you never get out of your head. And you can clearly see that Jordan Peterson never gets out of his head. He cannot get the hell out of his head. And that's why it's so impossible to be able to have a connecting conversation with him, or at least you watch it. I've never had the conversation with him, but you watch him having a conversation. And the only person I've ever seen be able to in some capacity, draw Jordan Peterson out of his head on some level for time is Alex O'Connor. Yeah. He's the only guy. And it's brilliant, because there's something about that kid, which I admire very, very much. He gets what's happening for Jordan Peterson, and he actually can bring him into a real space. And when Jordan Peterson says something like, I act as if you realize that he is nothing but a walking brain. And that's why he wears the suits that he wears. Because he has no sense of reality in embodiment, right, in a real world. And that's the reason why I really can't stand him I really have trouble with him, even though he says very intelligent things. A person in their own head is going to say intelligent things, right? But you can see when he talks, he's all here, right? He's all here, which is why his clothes look that way, right? No, really, I'm not making, it's funny, but it's not funny, right? It's problematic because his clothes are indicative of his thinking, yeah? And that's a thing. But anyways, go ahead.
The reason why I raise it is because it seems as if we're about deed and not creed. And I think about the line from the Yerushalmi that speaks in the voice of God, would that my people forsake me but keep my Torah. And then that's in contrast to the first of the Epicurus, to know God. Or actually the first of the Ten Commandments, whatever. So if what you're saying, that acting as if God exists is so problematic, does this line from the Yerushalmi not shed a little bit of doubt on that? Or how do you reconcile
the line from the Yerushalmi, right, that they left me and kept my Torah. You didn't quote the end of the line, which is, again, a problem of hearing details out of context, right? And even the rest of the line doesn't necessarily contextualize it, but the rest of the line is Ma'or Sheba Mahziran Mutav. The light in it will bring them back to me, right? Will bring them back. Which is basically what Rambam is saying over here about the kid that you carrot and stick him all the way up to loving. Yeah. So what he's saying is, look, if they genuinely were to leave me in terms of their faith, in terms of whatever ostensible relationship they think they have with me, right, and actually engaged in studying my word, right, and studying what I've said to them faithfully, they would reach. I have better hope, HaKadosh was saying, for them reaching me if they actually listen to me, right, and actually than whatever they're playing with in their head about me, about God. That's the idea. Yes. Patient. You're very patient. Thank you.
So, when we've talked at the beginning about not doing things because of reward,
Well, I want to. Can I just qualify that too? Because I don't want things to be misunderstood. Rambam is not saying don't do things because of reward. He's saying the ultimate goal is not to do them for that reason. Absolutely do things for a reward, right? Start that way. As a matter of fact, we teach people to do that, right? He says it's not great, it's not, but it's the way that we run. So you absolutely, you're not going to tell a kid, listen, until you understand how to love, and for that matter, love God, sit tight. You don't come to shul, don't do anything, no, we don't do that. And it's not an intelligent thing to do. You want to train the child. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that as a
No,
yeah.
That's actually kind of helpful.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to get into the difference between reward of doing something and effect of doing something, and whether the effect of doing something, where the limits of the effect of, because we are familiar, obviously, with the sort of brownie points, blitzing points, storm the heavens for pull the lever.
The mechanics.
How does he limit it so that we don't
How does Rambam limit it so that we don't end up in the mechanical?
Precisely.
It's his discussion of love. He really uses love as the paradigm, right? So he says, look, we teach kids to do this. We teach uneducated people to do this. Ad shetirbe da'atan v'yasu me'ava. It doesn't say that here. It says in the Hilchot Teshuvah. Until their da'at gets to the point, right? Till their connection to reality gets to a point, right? That they realize the world doesn't work that way, right? You don't push buttons, right? In real things, in love, you don't do that. And if you do push buttons in love, well, you'll experience what it's like, to do things like that. It usually doesn't work very well for people, right? People sense it very strongly. So until a person says, so he uses love in terms of that. And then he says Shira Shirim in its entirety. Is a parable for all of this and so on. So, yeah.
Quick one. So, you're saying how, and there's example, Jordan Peterson, is all in his
Right. That was not the point of the show.
No, of course. Does Rambam explain how we get out of our head? Is that part of?
Well, he doesn't feel that he needs to necessarily explain. I'm speaking on his behalf,
Yeah.
right? So, but I don't think Rambam feels he needs to explain that. I think some people accuse Rambam of that incorrectly, right? Because he's so intellectually inclined, right? He's very logically inclined, which is one of the reasons why I very strongly recommend that people read his letters. Because when you read Rambam's letters, you see his absolute humanity, right? His absolute connection to the most earthy, human, beautiful, engagements. So I don't think that Rambam explained those things. I think it was enough that Rambam, kind of explained these yesodot, right? Which I never actually finished saying. I just want to kind of round that out. The reason why the yesodot were not explicitly mentioned is because they were part of the wiring. Everybody just did this, right? They just approached life with these assumptions, right? These were on that level. That's why when you said axioms, I said yes, because on that level they were axioms. Nobody even thought that they had to be proven, right? They were just the system. They were part of the system. They were the system. The mechanisms of... Yeah, it's right there. They were mechanisms of the system. In Harambam's time, that was already breaking down. That was already being disrobed, right? It was already taking... So Harambam needed to say, this is what the wiring looks like, right? And that's what he did. In terms of... getting out of the head and all of that, I don't think that was... I could be wrong, right? And I'm very happy to be proven wrong on this, right? I don't think that Rambam necessarily saw that as a glaring problem that he needed to address. I think that became more and more problematic after the Enlightenment. Much more problematic, because it became the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, right? Two very different, separate things, but nonetheless brought us into a world in which... And, Western philosophy, look, it starts with the Greeks, there's no question about it, where they're kind of, just hierarchical, logical discussion, which, it's very, very, very easy to be able to be isolated. But I don't think that Rambam lived in that space so much. And I think a lot of it is because he was Eastern. People forget, right, that he was reading Western philosophy. He was an Eastern man. And he was still very tapped in and connected to Eastern mentality. So I think it was much less... He didn't think very much about that. But again, it could be that indications show that. I've never seen it.
Can I just follow up on that? What does it mean for you to be in your head or out? Like, what's it all as opposed to? And
again, it's hard to describe it. But the way that if I had to describe it, it's kind of like you know it when you see it, right? And the way that you know it is that there's just something missing about the presence of the person, of their physical body in space, with other physical bodies in space. Yeah. I don't know how else to explain it. It's very, very hard to articulate. Yeah. But, when everything can be a discussion, or forced into talking about it, or forced into granularly dismantling it, right? Which is what he always does, right? Experience is missing. Just being is missing. And that's one of the reasons why I will favor Sam Harris over Jordan Peterson very often, because Sam, as much as an Epicurus as he is a very embodied, present human, right? And I think that he's a step away from God. It's just that he's resisting it like a baby. And so, it's a thing. But, he can articulate beautifully, Sam. I mean, he's excellent at that. But he also does not over-articulate, in my experience of him. He doesn't over-articulate. He allows for experience to be experienced. He will say, if you don't understand it, you don't understand it, right? You just need to be able to know it. So that to me is the best I can do at the present moment.
Thank you.
Maybe slightly off topic?
Yes.
Based on
I shall be the judge of that.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, go ahead.
Based on the Rambam saying that the heart follows action, and I think other people say it also.
People do say that. No, it's a good. Yeah.
Is it more important to start with content?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is not a suggestion not to engage in maaseh. Rambam is not doing that here. I want to be, again, very clear about that. Rambam here is talking about Olam Haba. And because he's talking about Olam Haba, he's talking about tachlit. What is the ultimate goal? What are we trying to get to? What we're trying to get to does not cancel where we're at, right? So yes, if I'm starting out, of course I start with behavior. Of course I start with behavior.
Starting from zero, or if you're educating from zero, you should start from behavior before.
You start with behavior with teaching. The teaching is not the sophisticated teaching. The teaching is very simple teaching, and that do this because if we don't do this, you get in trouble. So we do start that way, right? And it's okay to start with kids, having a little bit of, fear of retribution. But ultimately, we want practice to precede substance, because it's much more difficult to introduce practice after achieving intelligence or substance. So that's why I tell little kids, say you're sorry. Sorry. Right? But we want them to do that. Why do we want them to do it? Because you don't get used to doing that now, you will never do it, and you'll be a disgusting person. Right? So we start with that. It's important stuff. Sorry.
Can I just add that that's an exceedingly Aristotelian view on pedagogy, on moral pedagogy?
Say again?
That is a very Aristotelian view on moral pedagogy.
Well, that's why Rambam is right.
Yeah, it's similar to the idea that the way you're meant to become a virtuous person is to first, when you're cultivating as a young person, is to look at what the role model does. And then you only then after a period of time will you start just doing the right actions naturally and recognizing the properties that they have, rather than just saying, oh, because I know that this great person did it.
Absolutely. Exactly right. But again, Aristotle, from an observational perspective, right? He didn't necessarily understand the mechanisms, but from an observational perspective was very sensitive to evolutionary development, right? He understood the human animal in terms of behavior, which is why his whole approach to deot, like Rambam presents, is behavioral, right? Practice. Go to this extreme because you need to be able to do. He didn't know about neural, connections and pathways and so on and so forth, but he realized that behavior is manifested this way in human beings. If you wanted a human being to do something, this is the way that you train a human being to do something, right? So he got that. But yeah, absolutely, very, very important. Yes.
I'm sorry, it's a short thing. It might just be me misreading, but in terms of
Oh God, I thought it was like a pre-finishing time. Sorry. Okay, this is the last question.
Yeah. In terms of as if thinking and fear of retribution, in response to Shua, with his, you need to see every action that you do as if the world is resting on it, and one sin will tip the balance and one star will tip the balance. Does Rambam not engage in a bit of both? He's doing the as if thinking, you need to see the world as if one sin or one star is doing that, and so does that not risk us getting caught up in our own heads with Peterson? And then...
Before and then, I want to understand that question, because I think I'm missing it a bit. Are you saying that because Rambam says that you should relate to something in a certain way, that's intellectual?
Yeah, it's a purely as if thing.
So it's not a purely as if thing, interestingly, because Rambam then gives you whiplash, right? And he shifts to, you do one thing and this is what happens to the world, right? He doesn't say, he ends it that way, right? It was like, I thought it was supposed to be an as if situation, but he doesn't. He actually ends it saying, you do one mitzvah and you tilt the entire world into. So that needs to be also understood in terms of what Rambam is saying, right? It is true, right? Ultimately, that everything hangs in the balance, always, right? Everything is always hanging in the balance for all of us. It's a real game that we're playing, right? It's not contained in some safe padded room somewhere. Everything matters. Everything matters. That may be too hard for us to deal with sometimes, but everything matters. And that's the antithesis to being in your head, right? It's not okay to just live it as if it's true. Choose. Either it's true or it's not true, which is what our forefathers have always said to us, right? Yehoshua says this to the people before he dies, right? He says, look, you need to make a decision, right? You serve God or you serve not God. I and my family, I'm going to serve God. But you make a decision. Do something with your life and decide what you're going to do. Eliyahu does this, right? How are you going to ride the fence? If you want to serve the Baal, serve the Baal. If you want to serve God, serve God. Stop being you lily-livered lunatics in which you can't make a choice in your life. Make a choice and do it. And the reality that he's exposing over there is you don't want to serve the Baal, do you? You just want to have fun serving the Baal. Well, put your money where your mouth is and jump the fence and do it. So that's the okay. Adkan. If anybody wants to pray out, I'm going to pray out.
Thank you so much, everybody. So next Monday.